Alright, we're going to zip through part 2 of the ASC practice test. Hope you enjoy this, and got some pretty good comments and questions on the last one and all. Alright, we got question 1 here. Enhanced live data shows the IAT sensor reading 101 Fahrenheit and ECT reads 43 degrees Fahrenheit. The ambient temperature is 45 degrees. What will the OBD2 generic data live stream display on the same vehicle, same vehicle show, look at that, on these two sensors? So basically what you're looking for, remember now, this is the enhanced, which is the OEM specific, and then your OBD2, which talks on a different line and comes from a different room in the engine controller, is going to display something different. Your IAT is going to display 40 below zero in the OBD2 stream, but a substitution has been made up here, and that can actually cause wet spark plugs on a cold day and that kind of stuff. What's really interesting about that, if you got a situation like this on a hot day, it'll start normally if the actual ambient temperature is close to this. But if it's a cold day and the coolant's reading 43 and this is substituted 101 for something that it feels like will probably work, it will wet the plugs and make a mess on a lot of these vehicles. Question 2. Part store pulled a P0128 and a P0172 on a customer's vehicle, but the customer decided to ignore the codes. 2 weeks later, he changed the oil and filter, but didn't do anything else. Immediately after the oil change, the engine wouldn't idle. He did everything right while changing the oil and didn't touch anything else. Now, I've actually seen this situation unfold, and what happened there was the crankcase oil contamination with fuel due to the cold running engine was having the PCV system was picking up enough fuel from the oil, so it had skewed the fuel trims badly enough. This was on a Chrysler, and an early 90s Chrysler, but the long and the short of it was, all he did was change the oil after he what the long story is, my dad called and said, I've got a power loss light flashing on your mom's Chrysler, and I went over and turned the key on 3 times and it flashed code 17. It meant it was running too cold. So I need to put a thermostat in it. He said, well, I can do that. So he put a thermostat in it. Drove it for another week or two, and then when he changed oil, it wouldn't idle, because the fuel trims were so accustomed to drawing that extra fuel out of the crankcase, you see, that when the extra fuel wasn't coming out of the crankcase, it was like a carburetor out of adjustment, and it wouldn't idle. And he called real frustrated. He goes, all I did was change the oil and now it won't idle, and I thought that was funny. I said, take the battery cables off. It'll, ordinarily you have to clean the throttle body, but I said, take the battery cables off. So he did that, and then when he put them back on, it idled just fine. But McGillicuddy's tablet here. On a roadside assistance call in Panama City, Florida, you find these live data readings on a mill light diagnosis. What's the reason for the high long fuel trim reading? I'll let you think about this for a minute and look at that. I don't want to jump too quick, And here's your little notepad where we're going to write the answer. Think about that. Formulate your answer in your mind. See what you see. Panama City is right there at sea level, right? So you got 29.98 inches of mercury there, and the Barrow is reading 24 inches, which is high altitude. And so it's calculating fuel delivery for high altitude. And that's inaccurate for sea level delivery, but it doesn't know. So it changes its fuel delivery calculations for high altitude, but that's not enough fuel. And the oxygen sensors are saying, hey, what are you doing? And so they actually start sending, they drive the fuel trim up so that everything will stay in balance. So you got a skewed reading from your barometric pressure sensor. Hold on a second. Oh, by the way, here's my coffee cup. You might like to see that. If you can see it. See my coffee cup? There we go. Look at that. It's got my logo on it. Anyway, there's only one of those, so don't get any ideas that I can send you one. Alright, so the O2 sensors picked up a lean condition. The PCM increased fuel trim to respond to the lean condition created by the skewed Barrow sensor. And you understand what I'm saying here. Let me send me a question if you're confused about that. This is basically, you got mercury, like you got let's say it's graduated tube here, there's a vacuum above the tube, and 14.5 psi sea level is going to push this up. You notice this is roughly twice this. Isn't that interesting? Anyway, so it pushes that mercury 30 inches up in that graduated tube, and so as the pressure it decreases out here, that mercury goes down, so your readings are going to be lower. That's just the way that works. A Pontiac with a 3.4 liter is being checked for a rough idle, but it runs fine at road speed. When you check the cold engine, notice the intake manifold gets too hot to touch within 90 seconds of starting the engine. What's the first thing you can think of that would cause that? EGR flowing at idle. You got EGR flowing at idle, it's going to make the intake really hot. I had seen this. I went to a tire store, and this guy that owned the tire store called me over, and he says, seems to me like they had to put an intake gasket on it or something, or an upper intake gasket. I can't remember. They had the upper intake off for some reason or another, and whoever it was that owned the car had disconnected the EGR valve electrical connectors, because that was electric EGR valve on that one. And they plugged them back in because, they didn't notice that they were unplugged, or if they did, they felt like, well, we need to put this thing back together right, so they plugged them back in. And it idled really rough, and they were confused by that, and I went over there, and so he said, let me walk out and show you this thing. It's been sitting out for 2 or 3 hours. So he starts it up, and I put my hand on the manifold, and it's idling rough, and the manifold begins to get super hot really fast. It was an aluminum manifold. And I said, that's going to be an EGR valve, and unplugged the EGR valve electrical connectors, and it, took care of that. Now, I don't know why the EGR valve was being held open. Obviously, the engine controller was confused and was holding it open. And so, one way or another, he didn't care anything about fixing why the EGR valve was open. He just wanted it to idle smooth like it did when it came in for whatever other repair they did. Question 5, an engine with a surge at low speeds is being diagnosed. It stops surging when the EGR is connected. Some of the plugs look like this. What needs to be done? What do we need to do to correct this? All right, what we got leaking valve stem seals causing deposits to form on the spark plugs, causing random weak firing events. Now, if you have one that you park and it sits in there for a while, in the parking lot for, like, say 30, 45 minutes, and you crank it up and it fills the parking lot up with smoke, you got big trouble. So that's valve stem seal is what that is. If you let it sit here and idle and it starts smoking at idle, it's a valve stem seal issue, particularly if you got puffy deposits on the plugs like these. The older GM vehicles used to be really bad to have valve stem seal problems, but the valve stem seal is right here. Is what it is. Now, you're not going to have this problem on exhaust valve stem seals, because on an intake valve stem seal you have low pressure trying to pull oil past that seal all the time anyway. You got higher pressure, pulsing pressure in the exhaust, going into the exhaust valve, so that one's not going to leak. As a matter of fact, you may even notice that some of your exhaust valve stem seals will not be the same type seal as your intake valve stem seals if you look at your kit and all. But one way or another, the seal is pretty important there. And if one time we put some valve stem seals on a Dodge truck, and they happen to be crummy, cheap valve stem seals, and those things, because of the lousy, crummy, cheap valve stem seals, where I did this at the college, they work their way up the valve stem. And it just started sucking oil down there past that intake into there, making a lot. And it was causing the oxygen sensor to read skewy. I mean, everything was really, and so we found out those valve stem seals we had just put on there, we had to get some higher quality, higher brand instead of aftermarket junk, to put on there. But question 6, using the readings below, calculate the barometric pressure. All right, can you calculate the barometric pressure using these readings that you see here? Maybe it's got something to do with the pulse width modulated fan duty cycle, you reckon, or the speed control or something like that. Let's see how I do this. 19.9 plus 9.7, and that equals 29.6. So that's going to be how your manifold vacuum and your manifold pressure, we talked about this the last test. When you add these together, you're going to get your barometric pressure, whatever it is. That's typically the rule. Based on this live data, which emissions component is suspect? Ding, 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 ding. If you saw this, what would you think? All right. This right here is in front of the cat, and this is behind cat on bank 1. See that? Now, whenever there's a bad cat's there, the back sensor looks just like the front one, but when your cat's good, your back sensor will be lazy, like you see over here on that side. I captured these on a Jeep that belonged to my doctor. He had bought this Jeep. It was a Jeep Wrangler, and he brought it in, and it was throwing codes for catalytic converters and all that. And we took the catalytic converters off. Somebody had gutted them. And these readings, as you see over here, came from that, and that was a pretty interesting deal. Question 8: a snap compression test yields this result. Which one of these might be the cause? A worn exhaust valve cam lobe, a worn intake valve cam lobe, a burned intake valve, or too much valve lash? What do you think? Too much valve lash might be something you'd see on a Honda, because you still got to adjust the valves on a lot of those little cars. Ding, 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 ding. Have you ever done these tests here? This is really a good test, and it gives you, you notice it. Static, the compression looks normal. At idle, the compression looks normal, the running. But if you snap accelerate it, you see a difference on one of these cylinders. That's how you can smoke out a problem. Well, the deal was, I was at in an engine performance class at KZ Vision one time, and there was 2 guys that were instructors in that class, and they brought up this, and they were teaching. They had on their screen what they were teaching was the static and the idle, because sometimes these numbers will be skewed if you got other problems than this one had. And all they were teaching was that, and I was thinking, wait a minute, they're leaving out the snap part of it. I didn't say anything, I wasn't going to speak up, but some guy behind me back there says, hey, don't you have a snap reading you're supposed to get on that too? And they said, one of them said, wait a minute, did you see that on the advanced engine, on the L1 test? And oh, I didn't see that on mine. I said, well, I saw it on mine. You're supposed to snap it. Those guys were sure. I'm not saying anything against those guys, but that was something for some reason or another they had missed out on. And what the deal is, the static compression is slightly lower, but still within a reasonable range. Suggests the piston rings and cylinder seal are mostly intact. Idle vacuum matches cylinder 1, pretty much. Okay, so you got no major intake or restriction leak or leakage idle. Snap response is significantly weaker, and it points to poor exhaust scavenging or delayed exhaust valve opening during high airflow. And so there you go. So a warning. You can read the rest of that text, but you see the point there. This is kind of how this works, and so keep that in mind. Question 9, 87 Honda Accord's got blue smoke at the tailpipe, unusually high compression, and this vacuum waveform. The indications are, what do you think? Look at that vacuum waveform. I'm going to tell you the truth. I'm lousy at interpreting vacuum waveforms. The camshaft timing is advanced. I took a picture of that Snap-on counselor with this wave pattern. Because Richard Sheffield came and taught a class at my, in other words, the Carport Auto Parts or whoever it was at the time, hired him to come and teach a class to the local mechanics. And so at the time I had just gone to work there, and the only car that I had a lot of cars later, but the only car I had that would run at the time was an 87 Honda Accord. And it was, and it was been sitting there. And so he says, you got any car here at all that will run? I said, yeah, I got an 87 Honda Accord, but that's the only one I got. And so I pulled that little car around in there, and he hooked up this Snap-on counselor to it, and he looked at that wave pattern. And he says, let's check the compression. And he looked at the back, and it was smoking a little bit. He says, let's check the compression. So he checked the compression on it. The compression was really high. And he says, this thing is a tooth off. The cam's a tooth off. Cam's advanced a little bit. And I said, really? And he looking at that waveform, looking at the smoke, looking at compression, he gathered that information. And so he finished it teaching his class, and the next day I told my students, I said, we're going to check the valve timing, the timing belt marks on this Honda Accord. So we went all the trouble to take it apart, and it was advanced one tooth, just like he said, which was pretty doggone impressive if you get right down to it. Well, the reason it smokes and the reason the compression's high is because the intake valve closes before it should, and it sucks oil past the rings up into the cylinder, and it's doing a perpetual wet test all the time, and it's burning a little bit of oil. You kind of figure that out if you think about it. You may not see this every time, but that's what it was. That was what it was doing on that one, and it was a high mileage engine too. Based on these waveforms, how many cylinders does this engine have? Now, carefully look at that waveform. Look very carefully at it. How many cylinders does it have? Not too hard to figure out. All right, it's got 6 cylinders, and the firing order on this one is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, like it is on a lot of your GM V6s and all. And so look at number 4 coil pulse is right here. So that's lined up with that particular compression stroke. It's the relative compression test, basically, is what it is. All right, and so, and when you can do that with voltage or amperage, it works either way. And I got this BT608 tool that I got from Autel that I've got over here, and it'll do a relative compression test. It's got software built in for that. Pretty cool. BT608, pretty pricey tool, but it's really functional. But anyway, you can count the pulses between these tall peaks too. And I'll also here, see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So you got 6 cylinders there. Now, if you know the firing order, you can basically look at this and see that, which one of these is pulling. All the compression's a little bit low, except for number 5, right? So that probably means that this engine is slightly out of time. So it's only got decent compression on one cylinder. You're going to have some, skewed readings at the very beginning when this momentum's getting built, but one way or another. So you got an engine here that's spinning it over. If it's got some compression on all the cylinders, but more on just one, typically is going to be the timing belt out of time. Well, here we are at the end. We only been here just under 18 minutes. I hope you guys enjoyed this test. Let me know what you think about it. Let me know if I made any mistakes, because sometimes I do. And we will talk to you guys next time. I'm really proud of my little cup here. I've had this for a while, and I actually had it pictured on here once. But I just love drinking coffee out of this thing. Anyway, talk to you guys next week.